Jane, the main character, is of French descent. She lives in a remote village in Vietnam. Her mother works as a teacher at the local school. Jane has two brothers, Pierre the eldest and Paul the youngest. Financially, their family is modest compared to other French families, but they are still considered more privileged than the local villagers. As the eldest, Pierre often took on the role of the head of the family. However, he tended to be domineering and intimidating toward his siblings. Pierre was like the embodiment of a father, which might explain his harsh demeanor. Paul, the youngest, was often afraid of Pierre and would frequently burst into tears. Although their mother was aware of this, she chose to remain passive and allowed Paul to continue suffering from Pierre's mistreatment. In their bedroom, Jane once expressed that their mother didn't really care about her and Paul. According to Jane, their mother only loved Pierre. Jane didn't even believe her when she said that she loved all of them equally. One day, their mother revealed her plan to send Pierre back to France because she could no longer handle his opium addiction. Even though Pierre was the eldest and considered the head of the family, he was completely useless. In fact, he had no job and often stole money from their mother just to buy opium. Meanwhile, Jane was studying in Saigon and only returned to the village during holidays. That day was the last day of her vacation, and she had to go back to Saigon. Her mother took her to the port and gave her money for the trip. While waiting for the boat to depart, a luxurious car belonging to a wealthy Chinese man arrived. Inside the car, the man noticed Jane relaxing and decided to approach her. He offered her a cigarette, but Jane casually refused, calling cigarettes the cause of lung cancer. The man, whose name was Tony, didn't give up. He tried to start a conversation again, but Jane was initially cold. Tony then complimented Jane's beauty, and eventually she started to respond. They began talking. Tony shared that he had just finished his business studies in Paris and was on his way home. When he found out Jane was heading to Saigon, he offered her a ride in his car. Jane accepted the offer, and they left together. Inside the car, Tony asked Jane about her age. She lied and said she was 17. Tony then revealed that he was 32 and joked about the importance of having a driver's license for verification. Their conversation grew deeper, and Tony gently touched Jane's fingers, testing her comfort. Over time, Tony held Jane's hand. When they arrived in Saigon, Tony's hand started to move over Jane. As soon as they reached their destination, Jane quickly left the car, said goodbye, and entered her dormitory. That night, Jane talked to her only friend at school, who happened to be the only other white girl there. Jane told her about the Chinese man she had met earlier. Their conversation continued until they started discussing the idea of being a woman's companion in bed while Jane tucked her friend in. The next day on the way to school, Jane spotted Tony's car. She was sure he was there to see her. Without hesitation, Jane approached the car. To get Tony's attention, she even walked up to the window before running back to school. After school, Jane looked for Tony's car again, but couldn't find it. She returned to her dorm with a slightly disappointed expression. By then, it was clear that Jane was also interested in Tony. One day, Tony came to Jane's boarding house and invited her to the Chinese district. They eventually entered a house that belonged to Tony. Inside, he explained that it was his bachelor pad, a place where Chinese men usually brought their mistresses. Jane knew why Tony had brought her there, but she didn't mind. Tony actually wanted to do something with Jane, but he was afraid of falling in love with her. Because of that fear, Tony suggested they leave, but Jane stopped him. She said she didn't mind being his mistress and showed that she wanted the same thing. Eventually, they went straight into it. Tony still felt embarrassed and hesitant. Jane, who was already tired of his hesitation, took the initiative and helped him. They ended up being involved for hours, as if ignoring the outside world. That night, Jane talked about her dream of becoming a writer. She wanted to write about life and her family. She also shared the financial struggles her family faced, including Pierre's opium addiction. Tony admitted that he already knew about Jane's family situation. He asked if Jane was chasing wealth. Jane firmly stated that what brought her to Tony was feelings, not money. After spending the whole day together, they left the house. Tony took Jane to dinner at a fancy Chinese restaurant. Unfortunately, Jane accidentally made a prejudiced comment about the Chinese. During dinner, she remembered her mother's words that a woman who had been tainted would never find a husband. Jane then asked Tony if Chinese men married women who weren't virgins. Tony replied that his culture forbade it. He also said that he couldn't get married again for that reason. Jane laughed and said she wasn't actually interested in Chinese men. When the bill arrived, Tony took out his wallet to pay. Jane, surprised to see so much money inside, couldn't help but glance at it. Tony smiled, noticing her reaction. That night, Jane cried, realizing she would never be able to marry Tony. After that day, Jane and Tony met frequently during the holidays. Tony usually sent his driver to pick her up from school. They started seeing each other more often. One night during dinner, Tony revealed that he was engaged to the daughter of a wealthy Chinese businessman. Jane asked if he loved her, and Tony said no. He hadn't even seen his fiancée yet. Jane wondered how love could exist in an arranged marriage like that. Still, she pretended not to care, admitting that their relationship had no future. They chose to stay connected despite the lack of commitment. One day, Tony's car was seen dropping Jane off for the holidays. This sparked her mother's curiosity. That night, under her mother's questioning gaze, Jane finally told the truth. She explained that the car belonged to a wealthy acquaintance who had just returned from Paris. Her mother then showed her a letter from Jane's boarding house, stating that she had been spending nights away. Jane tried to come up with an excuse, but her brother Pierre immediately called her out, accusing her of lying. He was convinced that she and Tony were involved in something deeper, possibly even exchanging things beyond expectations. Pierre urged their mother to punish Jane. Their mother, confused, chose to stay silent. After the holidays, Jane's entire family finally met Tony. He took them to an expensive restaurant, treating them politely and trying to engage in conversation. Unfortunately, Jane's family was only focused on eating the fancy food, acting as if they didn't care about Tony. Jane deliberately ignored him, trying to show her family that he was just a wealthy friend, nothing more. After dinner, Pierre asked them to go to La Cascade to rest and have a drink. Tony, being kind, paid the bill and agreed to Pierre's request. Even though Tony was respectful and generous, Jane's family still treated him rudely. Tony chose to stay calm, not wanting to embarrass himself. However, behind his composure, his eyes welled up as he realized that all they wanted was his money. It wasn't that Jane was a gold digger, but it was clear that Tony wasn't taking this lightly. That night, Tony took Jane to his bachelor pad. Jane remained silent, even though she knew her family had treated Tony poorly. Tony approached her and stared deeply into her eyes. Suddenly, he treated her forcefully. Tony's behavior changed drastically, reflecting his frustration. He felt exploited, just like how he saw Jane's family's financial expectations. Jane, on the other hand, remained passive and indifferent throughout their interaction. After that encounter, Jane became more materialistic. She started asking Tony for more money. With mixed feelings, Tony took out some cash from his wallet and placed it on the table. The next day, Jane gave the money she got from Tony to her mother. Her mother then spoke to Jane's dorm supervisor, asking them to let Jane leave whenever she wanted. Indirectly, her mother allowed Jane to sell herself for money. Sometime later, Jane met Tony again. She revealed that everyone at her school knew about their relationship. She felt isolated because no one wanted to talk to her anymore. One night, Tony asked when she would return to France. Jane replied that she would leave after the school year ended, but she might not come back because of her family's financial problems. Still in love with Jane, Tony gave her his mother's ring. The next day, he visited his father and told him about Jane. Tony asked for permission to marry her, but his father refused. He even threatened to disinherit Tony if he didn't marry the girl he had been arranged to marry. Tony told Jane everything. He admitted that without his father's wealth, he was nothing. Even though he loved Jane deeply, he felt he couldn't be with her. Jane urged him to marry someone else because she knew his heart would never fully belong to her. Tony then shared how his family had fallen into poverty due to his mother's failed investments. Their story was filled with sadness and helplessness, showing how complicated their relationship had become under family pressure and financial struggles. Jane chose to isolate herself in a small cabin, reflecting on her family's worsening financial situation. She suspected that her mother's failed business ventures were the main cause of their misery. In that cabin, Jane and Tony spent one last night together. The next day, Jane returned home. Her mother and Pierre immediately noticed the ring on her finger. They were confused as to why Tony would give her something so expensive. Not wanting to be questioned further, Jane took off the ring and told them to sell it. She said she didn't care about it. Pierre, always suspicious, accused Jane of sleeping with Tony. He even sniffed her clothes and said they smelled like food from Panda Express. Enraged, he beat Jane for sleeping with a Chinese man. Paul, their younger brother, could only cry and remain silent, too afraid of Pierre to defend Jane. A few days later, Pierre was finally sent back to France by his mother. His departure was heartbreaking for her since she had always held a special place in her heart for him. However, Pierre's harsh and insensitive behavior, like narrowing his eyes with his fingers, an obviously disrespectful act, overshadowed his character. Jane's mother truly felt his absence, and her sadness was evident. A few months later, Jane visited Tony's bachelor pad, which had now become his place of escape. There, she found him drowning in alcohol and opium, trying to forget their memories. Tony revealed that he was getting married in just a few days. On the day of the wedding, he spotted Jane among the crowd of guests. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away. After that, Jane returned home and found her mother preparing for their move back to France. Their belongings had already been sold. Then her mother told her something shocking. Tony had paid for their journey home and even settled Pierre's opium-related debts. Jane felt the need for closure, or maybe one last goodbye, so she went to Tony's bachelor pad. But the place was empty. She waited all day, but Tony never showed up. In the end, Jane went home feeling hollow. A few days later, Jane and her family boarded a ship to France. As the ship slowly left the harbor, Jane spotted Tony's car in the distance. She watched it until it disappeared from view, accepting the reality that she would never see him again. That night, Jane cried her heart out, feeling the deep pain of loss.